Hello, everyone. I'm Hannes Machor. I'm the director of the Cultural Forum at the Austrian Embassy in Ottawa. For many years, the Cultural Forum has supported Austrian artists to come to Canada to present their work. This is not possible in person now, so we have moved to digital platforms like this one. Therefore, I'm pleased to welcome you to this artist talk, which hopefully will be followed by others. My first guest I'm delighted to introduce today is Peter Lorenz, who is a young stage director and creator from Austria. Also joining us is Claire Love Wilson. Claire is a Scottish-Canadian multidisciplinary creator and performer. Peter and Claire will tell us about their experimental musical Morag, Your Longtime Date. The musical was meant to make its world premiere in Vancouver this February. This wasn't possible because of public health restrictions. So we will hear from them how they have reacted. Now, our third guest joining this conversation is Roy Surette, who is the artistic director at the Touchstone Theatre in Vancouver. They will all explain how they adapted to the exceptional situation we are all in, and which has heavily impacted their work and the theater scene, particularly small theaters in Canada and of course in Austria. Welcome, Roy, Claire, and Peter. Thank you for your participation. I would also like to welcome Matthew Rhodes, who is giving us technical support today. Before I invite Peter to get started, just a note that the opinions expressed today are personal and not to be associated with the Cultural Forum or the Austrian Embassy, unless explicitly stated. Now, without further ado, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction, Hannes. And on behalf of our team, I'm grateful that with this talk, in cooperation with Touchstone Theatre and the Austrian Cultural Forum, we found a different platform of engaging audiences interested in our work, as well as new ways of supporting us as artists in this pandemic. I will briefly outline our talk, which will last about 40 minutes, and will leave enough room for discussion and questions from the viewers in the end. If, however, throughout the talk you have a pressing question or want to clarify something, feel free to let us know either in the chat or by sending a question in the Q&A function of the Zoom meeting at the bottom. There will be room for one or two specific questions in at the end of each section, and a more free discussion at the end of the talk. Claire and myself will start by introducing our work and the key concept behind it. Then we will go on to reflect a bit on our working processes over the last 5 years. And this will lay the base for examining how both our creation and producing processes have been altered in response to the pandemic, including the cancelled world premiere of Morag, Your Longtime Date at the Push International Performing Arts Festival in Vancouver. Then Roy will explain a bit how their theatre company has been affected by the pandemic and what their coping strategies were. This will lead us to some reflections on responding to these new challenges, both for our piece as well as for theatre making in Austria and Canada, before opening the discussion in the Q&A session at the very end.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Hello, everybody. I can't see you, but I see some familiar names in the attendees section and some unfamiliar names, which is exciting. So first off, just a big thank you to all of you who are here with us today for joining us and taking the time to hear about our journey and this process and the wild ride of art making in what is the pandemic era that we're in together. Before I begin speaking, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm in my studio. Just sort of a simple expression of gratitude to these nations would fall short in naming the degree of influence that Indigenous teachers, artists, collaborators, and friends have had on our work. The show really wouldn't exist were it not for their guidance in modeling ways of approaching ancestry and tradition with open-heartedness, patience, and persistent curiosity. And the Protocol of Land Acknowledgement is also about recognizing the unbroken relationships of stewardship and sovereignty that Indigenous peoples hold with their homelands and have held since time immemorial. I'm grateful to be here. And as Hannes mentioned, my ancestors are Scottish, from Scotland. More specifically, all of my grandparents, so both my mother and father's side, they all immigrated here to Turtle Island when they were in their early 20s. And our new experimental musical, Morag, you're a long time DEID. Hannes, you did a great job at the pronunciation. It's inspired by my personal journey of reconnecting with my ancestry. And more specifically, a kind of quest to understand and learn more about the silenced story of my paternal grandmother, my late paternal grandmother, Marion Ross. So my search for Marion's story led me to uncover a deeper connection and curiosity that I hold with Scottish ballads. I learned while I was living in Scotland that my grandmother used to sing Scottish ballads and accompany herself on the piano. And my own ears and musical sensibilities were drawn to the haunting mystery and expansive joy that I felt in these old songs. The roots for our show comes from this dual place of uncovering more about my grandmother through a relationship with Scottish ballads, and from critically questioning and reshaping Scottish settler cultural traditions as a practice of reclaiming queerness in my lineage and inquiring around what does it mean to practice decolonizing as a settler. So the bones of the story come from a deeply personal place, but once Peter and I began working together, we decided to fictionalize the story, and the queer lead character, Sam, who I play in the show, was born. So in our show, Sam is searching for the story of her grandmother, Morag, and she inherits an intimate love letter composed of fragments of Scottish ballads and begins to imagine her grandmother's love life. And through the music, she begins to dream and uncover that Morag could have had this secret queer romance, and there's this kind of conversation between lives and identity that happened between granddaughter and grandmother. The spine of the work is really connected to the traditional ballads that we include and recompose in the show. Yeah, so our journey as a team with some of these old songs has been pretty incredible. It's a big part of the work. I grew up hearing not the grandmother that's featured in this show, but my other grandmother sing a few of these songs. But when we started to work on Morag, myself and Peter had very little kind of grounding in the ballad singing tradition. And I started what I think is quite a kind of diasporic mode of connecting with tradition. I went to the library and I signed out old anthologies of Scottish ballads. And I just started to play around with the words in my mouth and come up with tunes that were actually nothing to do with the traditional tunes, but just kind of making things up as I go and playing with the songs. So that was kind of a starting place. And Peter was also involved in that early experimentation. And then we connected with my friend and collaborator, Rory Comerford, who I met previously in Scotland. He started sharing some of his knowledge about the ballad tradition. And then importantly, our whole team was mentored by a master balladeer and songwriter, Alistair Roberts in Scotland. And I feel like where Peter and I can especially speak for myself as a creator and artist, I'm quite drawn to playing with things, playing with tradition, changing it, warping, disrupting, kind of blowing things up and then coming up with something new, which is a big part of our show. But I think that Alistair really taught us to be patient with these old songs and really kind of demonstrated the value of applying a really deep listening to like every image and every kind of musical note in these old songs, which is also, I think, a big part of our work. Of course, our show also relies on storytelling. We are kind of taking up the old oral storytelling tradition that you find in lots of all over the world. Also, you find it in Scotland. And so we've constructed this semi-solo show where I play several characters and I'm backed up by two musical performers, Rory Comerford and Rob Thompson. And yeah, in the version that we will hopefully soon premiere, the audience is also a big part of the work. So it evolved in an increasingly participatory direction. And in the premiere, the audience is cast as characters sometimes. And they're kind of, I work directly with them in direct address throughout the show to kind of make it happen.
Because this process of approaching and understanding the traditions and then step by step altering them to make them our own has been so deep and rich for us as artists that we wanted to include that process in the show. So we actually recompose and rearrange the ballads live on stage. For this, one essential tool on stage are the two loop pedals we use. These are simple machines often used by guitarists or any musician who wants to accompany themselves by recording a certain phrase and then playing on top of it as the pedal plays back the section. So you can record several layers, also called overdubs, onto these machines with a simple tap on the pedal, which makes them excellent live composing machines. So we use them on stage in order to create soundscapes that give a setting or context of a scene. We use them to embellish musical compositions. We deconstruct and rearrange the ballads with them and play entire scenes with the pedals, facilitating, for example, that Claire can have a dialogue with herself as two different characters. These loop pedal scenes enmesh themselves in an ever-returning musical world. Their way of working, playing back short snippets of sound as loops, are a beautiful acoustic metaphor for remembering, which we think works also in circles. With the help of the loop pedals, the character Sam therefore tries to remember and encircle her grandmother as well as her musical heritage. We are weaving together these electronic loops with the traditional ballads as well as original compositions, mainly by Claire, and use the music to get people moving, both literally and metaphorically through their emotions. There is a Scottish tradition called Ceilidh dancing, an evening of music, dance, and song sharing in community halls or pubs, where the band also facilitates traditional dances with everyone in the room. Sounds bizarre in these times. It's sometimes a bit like a spontaneous live dance class where you meet lots of new people and learn different steps as you do them along with the music. And one of our team members, Rory Comerford, plays also in a Ceilidh band and is an experienced Ceilidh caller. He sings and plays the tunes and at the same time teaches the audiences how to dance to them and counts them through. Inspired by this format, after our last work in progress performance in Vancouver in February 2020, we decided to include moments of participatory dance in our show and reimagine the entire show as a queer Ceilidh theatre, where the audience is taken onto the journey with Sam, but it's also literally participating in the creation of that story through their presence and imagination. So this may be a point where if there's questions about the piece, we can have a moment to stop. There's no questions so far in the Q&A or in the chat. So I think we'll just continue unless now is your chance before Claire is going on and speaking about how our process
Good on questions,
continued.
folks? Looks like we're good.
Looks like you're good. So
Okay.
Claire, please.
I'm going to trek on. So the next kind of section that we're going to talk about here is just about our process pre-COVID. So kind of how we started working together and what our working process looked like before COVID happened. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, so the process of Peter and myself working together has been quite the ride. I moved to Scotland as part of this journey around connecting with my grandmother's story about 7 years ago, and I lived there for just over a year. And I met Peter on a dance floor when I tripped and I almost fell, and Peter caught me. It's actually true. And we danced together that night, and we've been dancing together creatively ever since. We discovered a creative kinship between us. And one night in Scotland in a pub, I was telling Peter about, this connection with my grandmother and ballads, and he told me to call him if I ever wanted to make a theater piece. And 2 years later, I called him, and we've been incubating Morag slowly for the last 5 years. That time in Scotland was really fruitful. I also met Rory Comerford, who is our musical director, and he and I shared a love already at that time for taking old songs and wanting to breathe kind of new life in them and ask them contemporary questions. So Peter and I started a process of long distance dramaturgy, where I would undergo like different mini residencies on Coast Salish territory. Peter was in Vancouver, so we were ahead of the curve in terms of COVID collabs, long distance or online. We started collaborating actually online from the beginning of our process. And I would be experimenting and creating material. So an example would be like experimenting how do ballads work with loop pedals. And then Peter would be guiding the process dramaturgically, asking me great questions, helping to kind of focus and hone the process. After some of this initial work, I went over to Europe, and Peter and I kind of incubated our first round of grant applications with early concepts for Morag. And we worked hard on them, but our kind of story was quite unfocused at that time, and we were in the early stages. We applied for a bunch of grants, and we got none of them. And I just think this is an important thing to share, because I think with shows that, eventually come to have a life, you don't always see all of the times and the work that goes into the sometimes the years where it's not really doing well or it doesn't seemingly have momentum. And we certainly hit this period. But Peter and I, between us, possess quite a lot of perseverance. And we decided to move forward, and we actually self-funded our first residency that we did as a group. So we brought in Alistair Roberts, the mentor that I mentioned, and Rory, and we self-funded a residency in Scotland with the University of the West of Scotland's Theatre Lab program. And we spent a couple of weeks workshopping early concepts, so ballads, loop pedals, and we had this early draft of a script. And then we put up what we had kind of rehearsed in front of an audience. And in line with that grant rejection, our first performance of Morag in a workshop version went quite badly. The script was quite unfocused. I was trying to do too much as a writer. And Peter's concept for directing was kind of too much realism for the show, and it wasn't really fitting the tone of the music, the warmth that's kind of in this older musical tradition. So it was humbling. It was a very humbling moment. The audience was quite confused, and we almost stepped away from the project at that point. But I think in residency, we felt a lot of magic in the studio. We knew that we were onto something. We knew that the ballads were working with loop pedals, and that we were kind of surfacing some kind of cutting edge storytelling form that we had never seen before. So luckily, Peter, there's a lot of serendipity in our story. Peter got a job working for the Vancouver Opera as an assistant director, and he was here on Coast Salish territory for 6 weeks, and we got a chance to kind of go back to the drawing board in several coffee shops when we could gather in coffee shops freely. We just sort of pulled everything apart And we refocused. Importantly, we returned to like the central narrative that has always been core to the show, which is based on my personal journey of searching for the silent story of my own grandmother with a queer imagination and through these ballads. And then everything sort of started to fall into place when we embraced that story as the center. And then we needed something to kind of anchor the audience's imagination in this quite ethereal investigation into musical heritage. So we came up with the premise of the piano. So Sam in the show inherits this bulky piano. It's very tangible from her grandmother, and she has to figure out what to do with it. And in the show, it comes to symbolize a lot, including Morag's body herself. And another kind of aspect of our process that's been with us throughout development has been very much influenced by my background in Indigenous studies. And also our team's, I think, criticality and curiosity around approaching ancestral traditions with care and with respect. I did a degree in Indigenous studies at UBC, and it's really centered the question for me when I work with my own traditional songs right from the beginning. I was really curious about how can I sing these songs that are connected with a white Scottish colonial legacy here on Turtle Island on unceded lands. And what does it mean for me to sing them in a more respectful way, and in a more respectful and more conscious way? What does that sound like? What does it feel like? Is it even possible? And we don't necessarily content-wise focus on that element of inquiry in the show, but I mention it because I think it has been really important in guiding our process around how we work with tradition. And the kind of cultural protocol that we see as necessary for accompanying our show when we perform it on different Indigenous nations' territories. And another key collaborator, Rob Thompson, who's the sound designer and performer in the show, longtime friend of mine. He is a Haida artist and has also brought his unique perspective to working with Scottish tradition and musical tradition in general, and the kind of inquiry around decolonizing in artistic practice. Last but not least, on the producing side, what really fused everything together for us was that I had a conversation with Roy Surette, who is here on the panel. And as it goes in the artistic world, these networks of care and connection that we cultivate for each other. A mentor of mine, Anita Rashan, introduced me to Roy, and I sat in a coffee shop with Roy and pitched him Morag. And Roy, without knowing really who I was at all, and took a chance on this show and on us, and agreed to support us in our grants from the perspective of Touchstone Theatre, and that was a game changer.
From then on, our grants were successful with the Canada Council, with BC Arts, and Creative Scotland. We started from scratch, and we did another 2-week development residency at the National Theatre of Scotland in Glasgow and the Scottish Storytelling Centre in Edinburgh. There we concluded with a work in progress showing of just over 30 minutes, pretty much unfinished material. But this time we were not afraid of scrapping what did not work. This was most of the 2 weeks' work, trying scenes that did not work, trying to rewrite them, and then finally finding this intimate and honest storytelling style that speaks to the audience's imagination and relies heavily on the musical realm. This is when our co-creation process was born out of necessity, because we did not have much time, and we sometimes came into rehearsals realizing that a scene Claire had written before did not work, and we found that only a couple of sentences of the scene or a tiny moment of the entire rehearsal day did work. So I edited it together overnight in order to be able to have something new to rehearse for the next day. So after the work in progress showing in Edinburgh, we went on to expand our script into a 50-minute story with a clear story development and even an ending as we imagined it. Therefore, we together discussed a dramaturgical arc and developed frameworks for scenes or writing tasks with which Claire created scene drafts, long pages of unfiltered text material, really. And then I went in and chopped it all up, distilled the essences of it and made it as tight as possible, followed by Claire again adjusting the language and making comments and discussions around every single word to make it sound more like her own. So in a nutshell, that became our online co-writing process already in 2019, before the pandemic had even arrived. And Google Docs, which enables us to make comments and suggest edits live in the text, became the key transatlantic co-writing tool. After another 2 weeks of rehearsing in Vancouver together, we shared this work in progress performance in an old warehouse or artist studio venue that we turned in a pop-up performance venue with very little means, and presented the show in it as part of the Push Off Festival. So that's a smaller daughter festival to the Push International Performing Arts Festival that aims to showcase local artists to international producers. And it was a full success, I would say. The show had landed, and even though we did not get any international producing contracts from it, we had our foot in the door with the Push Festival, and of course, Roy and Touchstone's full support. But more importantly, we had realized that the storytelling mode with the music and the narrative really worked. We knew we wanted to flesh it out a bit more and expand it to about an hour and a half, 2 hours material, as well as take the moments of audience interaction further and trying to queer elements of the Scottish Gaelic community dance tradition that I was speaking about before. So we imagined a sweaty intergenerational dance party through which a story is told. What a great idea, no? But then the pandemic hit, and all these ideas of participation and intergenerational encounter seemed to become spells for the show during the pandemic.
This is another moment where we can open up for a question if there are any questions floating out there amongst you attendees. Oh, I see. Blake, I wonder if it's Blake Williams. No questions yet? That's okay. Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. All right, so how did things change with COVID-19? Oh, here's a question. In your reworking, did you ever think of making a second story? Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, as I kind of, you only want to know what happened next. That's a nice comment. I think I'll speak to that second story question. And there's another good question there. I think for Morag, because the source of the creation has come from this kind of very deep personal journey that then has become a deep personal and creative journey between Peter and I. There's been this like pretty strong seed as to staying with what the core of this thing is that I think has kept us anchored rather than, imagining like a completely different narrative. I think that we have imagined different frameworks for this story that would have been a very different show. Like at one point, Peter and I were talking about like an apocalyptic space, framing or something. And so we've spoken about different frameworks, but I think the seed of the story, again, because it's kind of quite an embodied and coming from a personal place, it has remained strong.
Can I just add something to this?
Please, yeah.
I think there was also part in the process that the work in progress, the very first one that really failed, the script of it included basically 3 stories on 3 different time levels that we, through the loops and the ballads, tried to bridge. So we were really trying to do too much. That's why the audience was very much confused on many levels. So I feel like it was more of a stripping back from 3 stories and like a moment of subtracting and focusing on what is the most compelling and the lens of that story, and then this focusing around one story. So I think that's maybe why we never, or like it wasn't that we wanted to have a second story, because we already had second and third story that we realized was too much, and that we wanted to give the time and give the audience the possibility to go really into depth with the one story.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to chug along here, but I think this interest from Fawn, I hope I'm saying your name right, about hearing more about Indigenous influence. I'd love to speak to that. I'll maybe speak to that at the more open Q&A, because I think it's an important question. So how did things change with COVID-19 for Morag? So continuing on, the next chapter, when COVID hit, things were looking really good for our show. We were getting really excited about our full-length queer Kaylee theater framework, and we'd been offered an opportunity, which we'd been working towards for years, which was to have a world premiere at an internationally renowned festival, the Push 2021 Performing Arts Festival, in partnership with Touchstone. This was extremely exciting for us. And yeah, grateful to have been offered that opportunity. Then the pandemic hit and everything kind of blew up, and we were all in full lockdown, as we kind of are now. Everything was suspended. So it was looking very tenuous as to what would happen with anything in our lives. And then the Push Festival, a few months into the pandemic, as you know, most local folks here will know, the Push Festival announced the sudden terminations of Joyce Rosario and Janelle Wong Moon, who are both two BIPOC women who are longstanding employees of Push and are integral contributors to the arts sector. Especially with Joyce, she'd been part of kind of bringing and seeing Morag and connecting us into the festival. And is, you know, a well-known, well-respected, nationally, internationally artistic curator and leader. And so the terminations really shook us as a team, as they did with the entire local theater community here. And alongside that community, we were angry and upset and confused by the decision. And we felt the urgent need, which is not a new need, to address, you know, what had happened, and also like look at a bigger theme of structural racism within the arts sector. So we went through quite a reckoning around whether or not to continue participating with Push. It took a couple of months actually to make the decision to move forward or to not move forward. We had, you know, great support and patience from Touchstone around navigating that decision. And we had some positive conversations with the Push staff around their desire to repair the harm that had been done and, you know, still compensate artists amidst COVID and try to do something positive. And then importantly, we were also talking to other artistic leaders here in Vancouver. And a group of those leaders who are more sort of senior than ourselves stepped up to convene something that was going to be called the Push Rally, which was supposed to be a kind of forum space to rally around what had happened, the terminations, and to speak more broadly about kind of systemic change within the arts industry. So with that happening alongside the festival, we did feel inspired to keep moving forward. So we did. And this launched us into a new remote development stage where we sort of took our previous remote development model and exponentially amped it up in order to get material ready for a full-length premiere. So we were taking our show from 50 minutes to like 90 minutes up to almost 2 hours. And so we had material to fill in, and we took our like Google Docs writing mode and really expanded it, took it to the next level. We ended up creating, I have my list here of creations, 5 new transition scenes, 6 entirely new scenes, an epilogue that has 3 new songs. We work with a new ballad and readapted it. And we did this in the course of 3 months, completely remotely. And it required a lot of trust and reliability and an orchestrated timeline, but a lot of connectedness around communicating and creating in a generous way. It opened up a new kind of generosity, I think, and trust in our process. And in terms of, you know, the reality of funding, we were fortunate to receive funding from PUSH, from Touchstone, from the Frank Theatre, from the Canada Council, BC Arts Council, the Austrian Ministry for Culture, and the Austrian Cultural Forum to make this production happen. So we've been really fortunate in being financially supported, but we faced a major hurdle, which was getting our European collaborators, Rory and Peter, actually into the country, which is what Peter will now tell you about.
It was quite a difficult situation because nobody really knew how to go about it. And neither the embassies on either side of the country could give us reliable information. The restrictions were changing quite rapidly, and online information was not always up to date. And generally, we just didn't know, and we were always referred to, oh, maybe at the end of the month the restrictions will lift. But we figured out that even though normally we were exempt from visa under the International Mobility Program for artists, which we had used previously, we now needed to get a work permit. So Touchstone employed us and we received our exemption number with which we applied for a work visa. Unfortunately, the online system did not take us any further since it was still not updated to the pandemic conditions. So when we entered that we are performing artists coming into the country, it resulted in letting us know that we just need a valid electronic travel authorization known as ETA, but that we would not need a visa. So the online system did not even allow us to get the cover letter from the migration office that we needed. When confronting the migration office, they could not give us an answer. We tried 3 times and also through a member of Parliament's office in Vancouver. Not even a senior officer at the migration office could help us more than saying that the only safe way is applying with paper, since the online process didn't work. But this would take at least 4 months, which then in October we didn't have. At the same time, we were confronted with the new COVID-19 measures in Canada, under which live performances with audiences were prohibited. So the PUSH Festival decided to only present work online. And in long discussions with our team, again, we figured out that we would not want to have a full online world premiere of this work, but that we would still go ahead to travel to Canada, finish developing and rehearsing the show. And instead of presenting it live, we were going to shoot a 30-minute video teaser version of the show that mainly focused on the musical journey in the piece. So back to the migration story. Although we did not receive the cover letter from the migration office, we got a support letter from the Member of Parliament's office, and the festival was confident that we would be able to complete the visa at the border and enter the country with a 2-week quarantine without problems. Unfortunately, the reality was quite different. In London, Rory was not even let onto his flight to Canada. And even after I flew all the way to Canada and spent 4 hours at the border there, I was refused entry, had to quarantine for 2 days before I was able to be sent back with the next plane. A very short stay in Canada. My passport didn't even get stamped. Physically I was in Canada, but formally I did not enter the country. But even the border officers felt sorry for us. They claimed that we had done everything correctly, but that still we were not able to enter the country, and that they hope we come back to show our art once it's possible again. This was a very much shortened version of all the bureaucracy, but if you're interested, we can go more into depth with this later. Anyway, back home, we had to create a new version for the piece. We decided to make a 30-minute audio podcast instead of the video, since there we could focus more on the music and easily produce it long distance. However, once we had this concept ready, which also did take a couple of weeks, the festival realized that they were not able to finance this undertaking fully, since most of the funds were already spent on the travel debacle. So we went for a new shortened concept of an extended track that we could realize with less than a quarter of the original budget to be able to at least present something as part of the PUSH rally. Since the program had become too thin and to be called a festival, they decided to include us as part of their international online rally. Just as we were ready to publish the newly adjusted promotion materials, however, the rally producers and curators stepped back and said that in the current situation, they would not go ahead with the programming. The festival had just not managed to reconnect with the community. The rally, the connection with the community, and being able to be part of open conversations on how the harm that has been done within the community could be mended and what institutional changes are necessary. All these were integral to our decision of presenting at the festival in the first place. But with the space no longer given, we also decided to withdraw from the festival and publish our extended track and host this talk now independently with the support of Touchstone as a Morag prelude series. Fortunately, we were able to maintain all the funding for the actual production of the show, so that we are now ready and optimistic that we will be able to have our in-person world premiere of Morag Your Longtime Date in Vancouver, hopefully as soon as it is possible again. Now, this was the long story cut short. I think it's another moment for questions. Are there any questions on the travel debacle and or the, how we adjusted to the COVID-19 measures, or a constant process of adjusting concepts? Then I think I would just go on, and we keep the question time also later. Yeah, Claire, maybe you continue with what it meant for our collaboration.
Thank you, Peter.
Process.
Oh, there, we got a congratulations. Yeah. Thank you, Monica. That's kind. Thank you. Thank you, Fawn, as well. Thank you. That's beautiful to be witnessed in that way. Appreciate that. To the comments that are coming through, those are appreciated. All right, so moving into a short kind of little reflection on, I think this reflection is a bit on what we've learned and how the last 6 months in navigating these challenges has impacted how we work together. Would be curious to hear about this in our more open discussion as well, other artists or just folks on the panel around their own experiences of this. But I think for us, navigating so many obstacles has really tested and strengthened our communication as a team, internally, and then with our colleagues and partners externally. Transparency and openness has become a really core value of how we work. So with every development, every decision, we were really pushed to step up to kind of courageous communication with each other and with everybody that could be affected by different decisions we were making. And this happened a lot, constantly, as situations were shifting externally and internally with push, with COVID. And we were constantly having to come up with plan A, B, and C's because we couldn't predict necessarily how things would turn out. So as you can imagine, this required a ton of talking over these platforms that we're using right now. And Peter and I came up with a sort of circles of trust system where we would first get clear on something together. Then we would involve our core creative collaborators and then our core producing partners, and then anybody else that might be affected by decisions or changes that we would be making. And I think this is a really important one, team learning, is that we importantly allowed our decision-making processes to be emotional, evolving, and relational. So as I know everybody's gone through in these COVID times, navigating all of these changes brings up lots of emotions, frustration, grief, confusion, and sometimes the feeling also as kind of younger artists in the field of truly just not knowing what to do, as well as everybody facing the pandemic and just having moments where you just don't actually know what the right move is. So instead of powering through to make decisions, we've been actively setting boundaries with each other and our producing partners in order to allow us time to explore different scenarios and perspectives and to listen to our hearts and integrity as artists when we make decisions. And we've realized that instead of operating from a place of just trying to make things work, we're committing, this process has brought us into a deeper commitment of centering care for each other, for our work, and for the communities that we're connecting to, and seeing this care as like a core guiding force for what we do and why we do it. And in reflection, this feels like an important unlearning it feels like an important unlearning of colonial and white supremacist approaches to art making in terms of those systemic influences in our art making that put product before process and engender a belief that it's more important to make a show or to make a show work than to take care of the networks of people, relationships, and community that actually make the art mean something. I've found that it's easy to talk about integrity, and it's a whole other thing to be practicing it consistently, especially when you're challenged, you're under pressure, or you're stressed. And in this phase of our show, an unexpected learning emerged for us, which was that we really started more actively fusing the artistic values that we espouse in our work, so actually in the content of our work, with the way that we're working with each other and in a producing realm. And these are values of respecting the cultural traditions that we work with. So, and my ancestral traditions, Scottish cultural traditions, also the traditions that everybody, we believe that everybody brings their ancestral lineage to the work that we do. Respecting our ancestors, respecting the lands and the peoples whose land that we create and work on, and applying a deep curiosity to music and storytelling. And we feel like in the last 6 months, we've begun to really see an enmeshment of these values more deeply into our producing decisions and the way that we work. And it's been transformative, and it's been hard. And we're still learning. Before the pandemic, I think the intention to have that deeper conversation between values and practice, of course, was there and was certainly happening. But I think that like many other white-led arts organizations, and speaking as a white person, there's a lot of work to be done around really walking the walk, around aligning values with practice and being curious and reflective about what that means, especially around anti-racism and decolonizing. So as a team, we're still learning, and we will be learning for our whole lives. But I think that this value of care, really centering care at all stages of what we do, and navigating the challenges of this last year with that care has brought us closer. It's made us more creatively resourceful, and I think it's made us more courageous as people and as a team. So I get to hand over the privilege of handing over the mic to Roy. I think we should just, I feel like I think we'll save the Q&A for the end here. We've been talking for a while. So Roy, I want to hear your thoughts around Touchstone and how you all have been navigating these shifts during this wild time.
Thank you, Claire and Peter. You're very articulate, and it's wonderful to hear some perspective on a story we've been kind of living in and having walks in the park and phone calls from a long distance. It's great to sort of put it into perspective. I'm also on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm in English Bay across the Burrard Inlet from Clare and Kitsilano, and happy to be able to work here. Touchstone Theatre also is in the downtown core, near in the building with the CBC and the Push Festival and some other wonderful partners. I was asked to put a little bit of perspective on what it is like for a producing organization to kind of feel their way through the COVID experience, and that's what I'm going to do. And it deals with Morag, but also with just our regular. So it's a little bit of a short take on our last year. Touchstone has been producing and presenting Canadian productions for over 40 years. We were in the final weekend of a play called Inheritance, a Pick the Path Experience, which is an investigation of the notion of settler land ownership on unceded Indigenous territories. It was an ambitious choose your adventure, multi-pronged co-production initiated by a wonderful company, Alley Theatre. We were in that last weekend in mid-March closing our show when word came that public gatherings would be immediately restricted. Larger venues were closed immediately and smaller ones were able to continue, but now with a 50-person maximum of attendance. We were about 3/4 through our season. Touchstone had 2 upcoming productions for the rest of this the spring season. The premiere of an intimate play entitled Lights, written and acted by Adam Grant Warren, an early career creator, a really excellent writer and performer who lives with cerebral palsy, and we were premiering his play. And secondly, an annual fundraiser where we do a full stage musical with a cast comprised of lawyers and members of the legal community. We determined that we had to postpone both of these activities until the beginning of the next season. And in that next season, Morag would premiere. It seemed far away, long and far away at the time we were making these decisions, so we had every confidence that we'd be able to proceed as planned. Of course, we were still more optimistic in March that the tidal wave of COVID-19 would pass maybe by the end of summer. BC is where the province where we work was successful in keeping numbers down, and theatre companies large and small began to adapt and create programs that would realistically perform within the limited capacity and incorporate safety protocols. We adapted our plans and wanted to follow through our commitment to the cancelled productions. And although it wasn't ideal, we proceeded to plan for Morag, You're a Long-Time DEID, as part of the Push Festival, even with the limited capacity. We talked about also live streaming an event to increase accessibility to the event. And as a company, Touchstone has flexibility relative to large venue companies that program large subscription audiences. We could ride the wave, so to speak. And that's what we were doing. We're not being as driven by the need for box office revenues. However, the tidal wave of COVID-19 revealed how precarious the finances of most nonprofit professional arts organizations are. Push International Festival was hugely affected, with likely to see at least an 80% drop in their revenue in the coming festival, and this led to some major immediate restructuring and the unfortunate terminations that Claire spoke of beloved long-standing employees. And when there was the community outrage about the terminations, the recently appointed artistic director was let go, which further destabilized the organization, and it was a mess. It was a very challenging time. Still, as Claire mentioned, we opted to persevere, knowing that there was going to be actions and initiatives to help mend and resolve the issues that had surfaced, this devastating rupture. Touchstone's theatre has a long relationship with Push. It was co-founded by our former artistic director, Katrina Dunn, and Norman Armour. And we wanted to maintain our positive relationship with our friends, colleagues, and neighbors at Push, and weather the challenges that the organization is facing. But instead of dissipating, the second wave of COVID worsened, which the situation led to heightened restrictions allowing for no gatherings. And it was agreed that we would wait until the piece could premiere before a live audience. It was integral to the evolving structure of the piece. So Touchstone has pivoted by taking some development work online, some play development work, and further postponing our scheduled productions. We've commissioned some online creations and participating in some podcasts and readings and safe initiatives. We're still operating within these restrictions. We don't quite know when they're going to end. And all of these challenges and commitments have deepened, I would say, more than anything. As you can see, Peter and Claire and the team have great integrity, tenacity, perseverance, and thoughtfulness in their process. And we're fully committed to trying to support the deepening that the project is going through right now. And we're not a co-producer, we're a supporting producer, but we're going to do everything we can to help make it a reality. Hopefully, the premiere will happen sometime in the 2021-2022 season. And we'll all dance. That's a bit of a summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you. I think it's maybe a good time to, I'm also aware of time, that we're slightly over our schedule, that we go a bit more into the Q&A section here. And then the last section that is still there would be like comparing a little bit to the theater scene in Austria, which we can, I think, do a little bit later. There was a question to still tap into, Claire from phone, about your about Indigenous influence on your story. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm unmuted now. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I think as I mentioned, you know, a important part of the origins of the story of Morag came from me, you know, as a settler on these lands, having the privilege of learning from truly like Indigenous teachers. I was in a program where all my professors were Indigenous. I was reading Indigenous political and cultural theory and sitting amidst Indigenous peers in classrooms. And I was observing a relationship with ancestry that I had never been taught in my own cultural inheritance. I was observing people at different stages of reconnection and reclamation with their traditions, and this, of course, is different for every Indigenous person and every person. But I think the modeling of taking responsibility and connecting with your ancestors, knowing about who you are and where you come from, and then thinking about how does that understanding of having a connection with who you are and who has come before you influence the person that you can be, and also how to take responsibility for one's position in one's life, especially in terms of, you know, a decolonial context in relation to, you know, living as a settler on unceded and stolen Indigenous lands. So in a way, my desire, my understanding of the need to reconnect with my ancestry very much came from actually looking around at the work that Indigenous peers and artists were doing. And rather than, I think that, you know, something that can happen is kind of appropriation. So wanting to, I guess, what am I trying to say? So rather than taking, like in our story, we're not using any like Indigenous content per se in the actual core story, but it comes from this process of me turning around towards my own ancestry and going, okay, what are my relationship with my cultural traditions? And how do I walk in a way where I'm conscious about that? And how do I reckon with these traditions in terms of wanting them to be relevant for me now? And my questions as a, you know, young settler, queer woman, and what does that whole process mean? So I think it's certainly the Indigenous influence has been core in terms of process. And then in our actual creative team, as I mentioned, like one of our core collaborators is a Haida artist. And we've also increasingly involved a Squamish cultural leader and musician, Dennis Joseph, into our work, who has been providing like leadership and guidance around doing deeper protocol, like deeper Squamish cultural protocol around interacting with, you know, the traditions that we bring into the show, the ancestral lineages, and really framing those and really grounding those on this land. And Dennis, Dennis is amazing, is incredibly generous and wise, and I think that the incorporation of that deeper protocol, so going beyond just like a land acknowledgement in the show, is something that we've really taken up as a whole team and has gotten us to reflect, everybody, around what are our kind of ways that we take responsibility for our ancestral lineages when we do our work. Hopefully that spoke to some aspect of that question, Fawn. I feel like it's a beautiful multi-stranded one. Cool.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this point?
No question is a silly question. We love all questions.
Should I just continue a little bit talking about briefly about the situation in Austria, and people can continue asking questions?
Oh, here we go. There's a question.
What is your musical background? I'm just going to answer my musical background. I'm actually not a professional musician, but I played the clarinet and the guitar for years already, and I've studied a little bit of music, but I've been working in the opera. But I'm actually not. That's not true. I was going to say I'm actually not performing music in this show, but in the last work in progress, at least, I was in the final musical piece from the box. I was playing the shaker. So that's maybe the need also where we're still looking for a percussionist. Yeah.
Yes, my musical, well, yeah, Peter, I think Peter's understating a bit how musical that he actually is. He has a deep musicality to the way that he works, and also I think that your background in opera has been just incredible in terms of, the ability to really deeply think about how do music and theater, how do music and text like really intertwine in a really deep way. Peter brings that to all the work that we do. My musical background is self-taught. Self-taught, lots of self-teaching. I played the piano for several years, being taught piano in kind of Royal Conservatory, and I come from quite a musical family. So my grandmother, who I mentioned, not the grandmother of this story, that Morag is based on, my other grandmother sings ballads. I've grown up playing music with my brothers. My mother plays the piano. So I feel like it's, as my Nana would say, I come by it honestly. And then, have just been singing my whole life, and started kind of singing at open mics when I was about 16 or 17, and started songwriting just from a place of needing to songwrite to express my feelings as a teenager, and have continued onwards to learn other tools. And the loop pedal has been, I feel I've had sort of different mentors, musical mentors, but a lot of it has been following my own curiosity and trusting and creating new kinds of processes for doing things musically. Cool. Thank you, Glynis.
So I'm just going to start on the Austrian part a little bit. So in Austria, theaters opened again after the summer. And already in the summer, big festivals like Salzburg, for example, were taking place with very elaborate hygiene concepts. However, in November, when the second wave really hit, they had to close again and have also not reopened yet. But fortunately, the big theaters are publicly funded in Austria and are not under threat. And since we got a new state secretary for the arts in April, we also have a very functional system of supporting independent theaters and freelance artists. So I'm, for example, lucky to be supported by the state. The big theaters have a lot of premieres ready to go since they were able to continue rehearsing. But at the moment, as they tell me, they can hardly go on producing new premieres before starting to show anything, because their storage capacities, both physically for new sets and mentally for the new roles, are reached. Me personally, I've been able to start only one project really, where we developed an interactive performance machine that we delivered in a pizza box to people's homes. So definitely a completely new format that only came about with the restrictions of the pandemic. I don't think even in the quest of finding new performance formats, I would have come up with something like this. We're not the challenge to make a performance lockdown proof. Furthermore, it also resulted in simply having a lot of more time. So it feels like I have 3 new performance concepts readily developed, and I'm currently writing my first play. However, I think everybody is getting a bit sick of constantly postponing, boiling their own soup, and preparing new projects that only exist in theory or online, and hence facing an absolute traffic jam in the creative pipeline. I still think that we will need some stamina. Recently, while discussing my next planned live project, which would be planned for May, we agreed that the chances of this actually taking place is maybe 50-50, so not very promising to start making plans. And I think that the creative sector will be amongst the last to be reopened, and we will be also affected more long-term. Funding structures might be cut, and international mobility might continue to be faced with obstacles. But in every crisis lies a challenge. And maybe in this case, it is welcoming to question how international co-productions like ours can be realized more sustainably, how cultural connections and collaborations can be deepened, maybe in a way as we have been trying to do in the last years, and continued more long-term. And how, for instance, we can imagine a slow tour of this show that would involve community engagement, as well as being designed in a way to be more supportive for the well-being of the artists involved. Have some questions appeared in the meanwhile? No. Yeah, that's it from this side. Or if there's any questions regarding the process or piece, anything from the talk, but also theatre making specifically in Austria or in Europe, or in Canada, wherever you are, it's a welcome time.
If not, Peter, Claire, I have got a question.
Great, Hannes.
Do you envisage further joint collaborations?
That's an interesting question, and I have a very immediate answer to that. I think because this process has been so intense and never really come to completion yet, we never actually, and it's quite rare, I think, like never actually talked about a next piece, because it's like still so much in the push. I mean, we still haven't premiered it even after 5 years of working on it. However, today on a walk, now I'm gonna state this publicly, I had a feeling that like truly that we're gonna make another piece together that's completely different. At least Claire, you and me, and probably the other, like it really has felt like all this has brought us so closely together that we are actually like a company, like a theatre company that just does another play afterwards. Even though it seems bizarre, a company that is spread between Canada, Austria and Scotland, involving also Rory. But I think the way we've been working has been so rich, and we've learned so much from each other and continue to do, and the way we are respectful of each other, and also we support each other but also push each other, and I think it's, yeah, I'm really excited for this to premiere, but also to see what can come after.
Great, thank you.
I would agree. I would be in agreement. I didn't know that about Peter's walk today, that he had. One of the exciting things about working transnationally is that we often wake up to new revelations or emails or material from each other. So while I'm sleeping, Peter does amazing things, and I wake up and I do things. So that's not uncommon in our process. But I think my response to that would be just kind of to circle back to the kind of theme of like, what does it mean to center networks of like care and relationships and creativity, and really relationship centered making, art making and being. And I think that this whole year, as well as this whole process, like we have really strong relationships, and they're getting stronger. And I have faith in those relationships to continue to grow and deepen, and that, you know, our creative questions and the ability to make things based out of that relational richness, I don't see that going away. So I'm really excited about what other forms that could take as we continue on our journeys.
That was very interesting. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time together.
And there's just one more question that just came up. Can we just answer that one?
All right, sure.
Sorry, Hannes, to interrupt you. The question is, do you Zoom walk together as part of your creative process? Actually, we've not yet, but we've sent each other for walks. Like, not only this all, like, we took walking has been quite integral for the process. So like very early on, Claire kind of went on walks with the ballads, but then also, that's walking has been a big part of the process, but we've never Zoomed while walking. I think it's mostly connected to the time difference of, like, now it's 9 o'clock here and it's 12 o'clock over in Vancouver. So probably that's the reason why we've not Zoom walked yet, but it might it's a great suggestion. Thank you. I think we both get inspired very much while walking, but then the other person is sleeping, and then we tag team the walking. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Hannes. Now you.
No
I think
problem.
That was the last question.
No problem. Well, thank you very much, Claire, Peter. The insights you gave us of your play have whetted our appetite to see it. Roy, I found your description enlightening of how you had to adapt to the many restrictions and how you managed to find solutions. Peter, I understand your frustrations in not being able to come to Vancouver and to stay there, to actually stay there and to finish developing the show. I do understand that border control, and I mean, it has been a necessary element in global governmental efforts to contain the spread of the virus. So anyway, let's hope that the pandemic will be over soon and that we are all able to return to normal life. I think a conclusion that we can draw from this conversation is that digital formats have offered the cultural sector a reasonable, albeit not ideal, alternative for a limited period of time. We have the advantage of bringing people together from all parts of the world, like today. However, they are not a permanent solution. They might in the future become an additional complementary option, but I think we all agree that nothing can replace the in-person experience. So thank you once again, Peter, Claire, and Roy. A big thank you also to Matthew, who is working behind the scenes, giving us technical support. Of course, we thank our viewers. We wish you all the best, and above all, stay healthy.